we're living in this moment that is a pandemic, but we're also like living at this bridge point that feels like it's a mix of 1968. Think about how many riots and how much angst and how much strife, around identity was ripping at the nation's core in that moment. And 1929, Great Depression. We haven't even seen what's to come in terms of the recession on the horizon and the struggles people will have.
Hey everyone, welcome to Seen at Work, the podcast. This is the podcast where we highlight diversity and inclusion professionals and the initiatives they're leading to help their fellow employees feel seen at work. I'm Natalia Eileen. I help companies build more diverse, more inclusive workplaces. And today I'm bringing to you a conversation I had with a fellow diversity and inclusion professional, Brendon Jobs. Brendon is currently the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the Haverford School for Boys, a K-12 all-boys school located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In addition to serving the students and employees of the school as a diversity and inclusion professional, Brendon also teaches a class on modern Black lives as a member of the upper school faculty. Brendon and I chatted the day after George Floyd was murdered. As you can imagine, we chatted with heavy hearts, and our conversation centered around both the climate given the pandemic and given the current state of Black lives in America. Now, he shares a lot of resources, so I tried my best to collect all of them for you in the comments section of the YouTube video that accompanies this episode. You can also find those resources and Brendon's full bio on our website at seenatwork.com/podcast. For many of us, this week, the last few days, this time has been very taxing, both personally and professionally. My hope is that Brendon's thoughtfulness and reflective energy radiates through this podcast and gives you the pause and the fuel you need to keep going. Well, thank you for being here. We're excited to have you on. I'd love to get started with you just sharing maybe a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you're doing now.
So I'm going into my 14th year as an educator coming up here. I'm from Philadelphia, city of brotherly, sisterly, personally love. And I started teaching at the Philadelphia High School for Girls back in 2007. I was there for about 7 years. I still talk to a lot of the students who were students back then, who are professionals out in the world now. So that's really my heart and soul. That's the heart and soul of my teaching practice, that space. I taught in a co-ed space for about 3 years before moving into private schools. And I'm still, working as an educator in private schools, but I'm also administrator, director of diversity and inclusion at the Haverford School for Boys.
Nice. And what does that role entail?
Well, it entails a lot, and it's also kind of being built as we go. I'm the first director of equity and inclusion the school's ever had. So I say that not as a non-answer, but as a way of saying that, the role is ever evolving. Next year will be the 3rd year of the role officially. Although I've been kind of doing some of the work to build it over the years. I work across all 3 divisions of the institution. The school is pre-K through 12. So there's a lower school, a middle school, and an upper school. So I primarily work with students in the upper and middle divisions, helping build and sustain affinity spaces. But I also work with other administrators and faculty and support trainings around cultural competency and around anti-racist teaching practices and around you know, 21st century pedagogy, you know. So the way I've had it best explained in my industry is, you know, inclusion directors are kind of mediating forces in school spaces. So we act as folks who bring people together within community spaces around a domain that is still too new to a lot of schools.
Yeah, that's a really cool way to think about it. So it sounds like you're doing your job in different contexts, but almost for every community your school touches.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And I like to think about it as I'm like an in-house consultant in a lot of ways, because a lot of the work is, you know, something's gone wrong, or nothing's gone wrong yet, and I just don't know how to approach this. Can you support me? So there's a lot of support work that happens kind of on the fly.
Mm-hmm. So I'd love to hear if there's anything maybe that's been most prominent in your work lately, or something that you'd really want to share with us as an initiative you've started recently, anything like that?
I guess with COVID-19, this pandemic has really shifted the way inclusion practitioners are working, you know, because so much of the work is about social-emotional health and learning and connecting with other people in common space and being together. And, you know, how do you do that over these screens? You know, it's really shifted the way the work looks. And I think in a lot of places, potentially, you know, the work has fallen off because of that. And other places have really struggled to figure out how to adapt. I'm in the boat where my space has struggled to figure out how to adapt to this new reality. The idea is that, you know, we're in this virtual situation now. Even if we go back to school in September, we might go back, you know. So there's also future planning for how do you sustain virtual spaces. So I guess an initiative I'm proud of so far is the virtualization of a lot of these affinity group spaces and these training spaces. About 2 months ago, we were told to leave school with the prospect of returning. And, you know, a couple weeks after that, we were told that we wouldn't be returning. I'm glad that my community didn't wait until, you know, we returned to resume our work. Mm-hmm. Within that week, or by the second week, I think the first week was just a shock, you know, like, but I think by the second week or second or third week, you know, the students in the upper school had already started resuming their affinity group spaces. So for people that don't know what affinity groups are spaces where people with similar experiences can come together and commute. You know, affinity space work and experience can look any myriad of ways. Mm-hmm. The idea is that, you know, when you're in this space, you don't have to explain yourself or explain your experience as much to people who might not get it, you know. So a couple of spaces that we have are the Black Student Union in the upper school, the Pan Asian Students Association, the International Students Association, the Gay Straight Alliance, and also the Jewish Students Association. All these groups were built by students, which is also, I think, well, that's something to be proud of, you know. Students stepped up and said, we want this space because we need to connect with one another. So these spaces virtualized in that, you know, we used these digital platforms to actually connect around what we were experiencing as people living through a crisis in this historical moment. I needed that as much as I feel like they wanted that, you know. Mm-hmm. And once they started doing that in the upper school, the middle school started to resume some of their spaces. So we have a middle school group called I'm Not Kidding, Inc. for short, which is a collection of, it's not an affinity group space as much of it as it is a space of people from multiple affinities. But they were meeting consistently also to really kind of breathe together through this moment. So I'm excited about those. And actually, this afternoon, I co-teach with a faculty member at school, Susanna Lambor. We co-teach this faculty training session that lasts 10 months. People sign up for it as a cohort. It's called SEED, Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity. It's a program that was started out in California by Peggy McIntosh, the designer of the white privilege knapsack. So the training goes through race, class, gender, and all of these different pieces that make up who we are, and gets people to think through what their lived journey is in terms of, all of these aspects of who they are. Because with the idea that, all of these pieces of us show up in our classroom practices, show up in how we relate to one another in a school community, whether or not we realize it or not. So I'm meeting with them for our last session today, and we virtualized those right away too. So I've been encouraged by that.
That's great. That's kind of where my mind was going too, where the students seem to really pick up on the virtual, like, okay, we're in a virtual world, let's do this. I was wondering if the faculty also caught on to still having these kinds of conversations and building that kind of community, even though they were separated from each other. And in many instances, I imagine some of your fellow coworkers are now with family members they weren't previously thinking about 24/7, or children and whatnot. Did you find that also was a fairly seamless transition with the faculty?
I don't think any of it was seamless. As many people as many students and faculty have shown up to the spaces, we've also lost people, who are overwhelmed with the weight of what the world's feeling like right now, so not seamless, but in many respects, smooth,
Yeah.
So I think the hardest part was getting used to emoting over the wires, actually being able to connect with what somebody else is going through or sharing without being in the same energetic space as they are.
I wonder too then, for the students, were there hiccups and bumps that you had to facilitate in any way? Maybe even helping your teachers in supporting the students through this whole process?
For me, so far, I feel like, I think I mentioned that this role is kind of like, you're like a mediating force in these schools.
Yeah.
My administrative challenge has been being the communicator, right? In that, how do I say it? You used to be able just to say, so we're going to meet at this place, let's meet in this classroom, but now you have to set up the Zoom chat or set up the Google chat and make sure everybody's aware of the passcode and make sure that there's no glitches and make sure that people know when we're meeting and when we're going to finish and be respectful of time. And so that's been my administrative work, right? So something that I've started doing, which is simple, but I think worked well so far, is setting up an equity and inclusion newsletter that goes out every week, right? So at the beginning of the week, just like you would get a schedule of what's happening with the overall school community, the community also gets a separate equity and inclusion update that offers some tips, for thinking about how to just breathe through this moment, whether or not you're showing up to group or affinity spaces or trainings. But it's also been this space where I've been able to share different articles that I'm coming across, different workshops that I'm coming across. This moment has been really beautiful in terms of I don't want to call it free labor, but people like Eve Ewing, people like Imani Perry, people who you would have to really schedule out time to get to your community are just doing these free workshops. And these, Mark Brackett is somebody who he's the director of socio-emotional learning at at Yale University, he's been also giving these workshops for free, right? So that these equity inclusion updates have been spaces where I've been able to kind of filter out that information to the community for people that maybe don't want to show up, or who are maybe exhausted
Right.
with on these screens, which is also real.
That sounds like such a great idea, and it sounds like also something that's new. You didn't do those newsletters previously?
I always wanted to, but I was always too busy, you know. And there wasn't an imperative, you know. People were showing up, the work was getting done, and you could also like catch up with people and remind them, do that nudge, hey, we didn't see you. So now it's an imperative. Like, how else do we maintain this community without the confines of school walls?
Yeah. That's awesome. I love those things that are coming about that maybe we've always wanted to do, or that make sense in this context, but actually they make sense in all contexts. Like, you know, we should keep doing this no matter what, and really benefit the community. Is there anything else like that in your world right now? Or is it kind of, you know, have you really just felt that a lot of what worked previously, you're able to move into this new virtual world pretty directly without those adjustments?
No, I think that's been the biggest thing, and that's also been something that I feel like day by day, week by week, in community with this group of people who are showing up to the spaces and participating actively, we've been tinkering with. You know, it's not perfect. It's still not perfect.
Right.
I don't think it'll ever be perfect, but it's not. There's so much room for growth. You know, in that, you know, how do we get people who were a part of the community, who are now taking a step back from being actively engaged with people? How do we get them back in? Or like, is there a way to, you know, I always think about measurement, and I think that's the administrator part. You know, how do we measure that this is working? How do we think about progress? I don't know if people are actually going to those workshops. You know, I get some really good calls. I have some good one-on-ones with folks. I use Calendly. Do you know that?
Yeah.
I love it. Oh yeah, Calendly, but not everybody does. So part of the work is like I said, being an in-house consultant. So Calendly's been a really important, you know, tool for me. You know, how do I have office hours when there's no office? You know, easy for people to just click and schedule with me. I don't know I don't know how to measure whether this is working.
Right.
I know there are a lot of things happening, and there's a lot of good free content that's out there that I'm benefiting from, if nothing else. I feel like I've grown so much in this moment. One thing that I think of is Arunati Roy's "The Pandemic is a Portal." Heard of this?
No.
When I brought up Imani Perry, she's a professor at Princeton University. I went to go see her at a talk at a school in Philadelphia called Friends Select, and just was taken with the kind of mindful energy she created in this space. I've also been taken with the type of books that she writes. She wrote a really awesome biography on Lorraine Hansberry that really like captivated me. And you know, the energy in that book translates to the energy that she projects. And she just happened to, like, not very long after this whole pandemic began, have a conversation with Arunati Roy, who's it was a 2-hour talk, so I'm not going to do it justice. But I mean, like, the kernel that really stuck with me is that, you know, the pandemic is a portal, you know, in that you can look at this pandemic as a crisis moment that we all need to struggle through together to get to the other side of and get back to normal, whatever that is. Or we could actually look at it as a portal to another place, a portal to another reality, you know, about all of what wasn't working in terms of how we connect with each other before any of this pandemic stuff happened. Think about what's persisting. Like I'm thinking about the murder that happened yesterday in Minneapolis, I think it was. I'm thinking also about um, the situation in Central Park, you know, where this white woman called the cops on a black man who wasn't bothering her. These are patterns that existed before the pandemic. So part of that talk was like it opened up my heart and opened up my imagination to, you know, what can we leave behind from this moment and what can we take into what we build as a new reality, you
I
know?
love that.
And that was just one talk, you know, there's so much that's being offered for free and in a way that's asynchronous. You know, you don't have to be there for that talk. I can send it to you after this, you know, and that's been a really, I think, important boon for equity and inclusion work in schools. You know, so often educators, my colleagues, and students are like, you know, I had too much to do. I was just too busy, you know.
Yeah.
Or there's like a pay block where you can't get access to something because it's $200, $300, and you know, cost benefit analysis. This is free,
Yeah.
and that has been a personal blessing for me because I love this work. It's not it. So one of my mentors always told me, and this is going to sound cheesy because it is, but I love it. I'm an educator. I love being a little cheesy. You know, if you find something you'll love, you'll never work a day in your life. You know, you heard this before.
Yes.
In I feel like in a lot of ways I live that because I mean, whether or not I was doing this type of inclusive work in schools, I'd be thinking about this stuff all of the time. You know, I'd be desperately seeking people to unpack what I experience with, and you know that's the work.
Yeah.
So all of these free materials and workshops popping up, it just gives people even more opportunity to get in where they fit in, wherever they're starting.
That's awesome. And you're putting it all together in these ways, whether it's by making yourself available through a Calendly link or by putting it in a newsletter that people can access, which it sounds like such a beautiful thing, especially since you're so plugged in. I want to get access to this newsletter. But I wanted to kind of transition. You started talking about the challenges a little bit, but you quickly shared some great ways that you've been able to overcome those challenges, whether it's by putting yourself together, you know, finding ways to connect virtually, emote virtually. Are there any other challenges that you think are worth sharing that maybe trying to understand, especially in this context of this virtual world?
There's a couple that come to mind. I'm trying to figure out how to articulate. You know, I think immediately about socio-emotional health and well-being. You know, so for people who are really, really struggling in this moment, you know, how do you convey a sense that it's okay that you're struggling?
Mm-hmm.
And not that it's right, but that it's okay to admit that you're struggling. I feel like we, part of like the American ethic is to overcome whatever barriers thrown in front of you. And in so many ways, you know, that just isn't healthy. Like sometimes it's important to stop and breathe and to phone a friend for help or support or for an ear, you know? So I think I struggle with figuring out how to make that plain for people in a way that they hear, you know, especially people who've disconnected, you know. And that's just within my little school community. I'm thinking if you look more broadly, I think I saw in our paper down here, the Philadelphia Inquirer, that Philadelphia public schools, I taught in Philly schools for 10 years before this. So I'm still really like and I live in Philadelphia. I live in Germantown, Philadelphia. So I'm paying attention to what happens. I think 60% of students didn't show up for online classes.
Oh, wow.
And that was within the first week or two. So I wonder if that stat would improve as time goes, but so something tells me there that there are folks struggling to access, or there are folks struggling. Even if you have access, like I have internet, I have all of the screens that I need, I can get there. Mm-hmm. There's an exhaustion factor that comes in. Like I'm not available for this. The world feels like it is in tumult. This is not. I'm not available for this. So part of what I struggle with as an inclusion lead or as an equity lead is, how do you convey a sense that it's important to name that struggle, and not have the answer for how to get beyond it.
Right.
It's hard for me to even say that as the concluding point. How do we get beyond that struggle? I think people are having trouble just naming the struggle.
Yeah.
Another challenge that I find, I think, is this idea that, and this is also very American, not my backyard, or if I don't see it, it doesn't exist, or not my problem. These are very elegant ways of stating what that pattern is, but that pattern is real. There's an article that I read in the Atlantic. I forget the name of the title, but it was about America's racial contract. And the kernel of the argument was the idea that, although we have laws and policies that are set up for all, the experience and also the enforcement of these laws and policies are different based on who you are in society. This isn't going back to the 80s or the 60s or the 50s. This is going back to the beginning of the nation.
Right.
I'm a history teacher at heart, so that really resonates with me. And on social media, I'm seeing, and in the affinity spaces, people are bringing to the table instances of, for instance, those protests that we saw in places throughout the country where people were like, open the country back up, because I don't see a pandemic in my community. Just because you don't see it in your community doesn't mean that it's ripping apart another. So I guess to name what the challenge of that is figuring out how to create an access point for empathy for people, for care, for people who might feel like everything is fine for them, so it must be fine for everybody else, because that's not real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate both of those. I appreciate you articulating both of those challenges, because I think whether it's the first one where you're creating a culture that allows for people to understand that it's okay to feel, right? Whether it's that, or the second one where you're saying empathy is an important part of any person's experience, especially in this global experience that we're all having. I think in both of those instances, it's such a beautiful thing to be building into the culture, to be like just pushing in to people's brains, and making it the kind of space where that's a priority, where both of those things are a priority. It's just such a beautiful initiative, even. But they're both challenges, because it sounds like they're not very easy to do.
Yeah, and the entire nation is struggling, with this. I was talking to my head of school, John Noggle, and something that he said early on in one of the conversations that we've had over the past couple months, that's resonated with me since, is this idea that, and I know it's more complex than this, because humanity is complex, but we're living in this moment that is a pandemic, but we're also like living at this bridge point that feels like it's a mix of 1968. Think about how many riots and how much angst and how much just strife, around identity was ripping at the nation's core in that moment. And 1929, Great Depression. We haven't even seen what's to come in terms of the recession on the horizon and the struggles people will have. So when he said that, and it just put this moment into a historical context. And I think, if we were honest with ourselves as people and as a country, we'd see and feel. And I wonder whether or not that would change the way we react to the push to get back to normal, the sprint to try to overcome this, to win this war. This isn't, you don't pick up arms and defeat this. It's far more complex than that.
Right. Now, I think what's interesting too is that these are the kinds of conversations we have to have as diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals. We can't just kind of put them off to the side and focus on the job. The job is this, and for everyone too, this should be a part of everyone's job, if only because we're all being so impacted by it. And it also makes me think about the humanity in all of it, or the human psychology in all of it, that we have to continue to grapple with every day, whether it's because of the pandemic or not. That's really what a lot of this work is about, right?
It is. And as you were talking, it brought up for me a space that I'm going to engage in. I invited a lot of my faculty, my colleagues in my school. I also put it on LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm just trying to get anybody who wants to join in on it, because I think that part of shifting the consciousness or the practice around that is being in community with people who are trying to do the same. There's an organization called BARWE, Building Anti-Racist White Educators. There's a group of teachers in Philadelphia, some of who I knew when I was working there, who put out this survey. And the survey is just, Google Doc, and there are 4 books on it. And they asked, anybody who gets this form, choose your top 2 books and choose the time you'd want to meet, and let's do a reading group on the books of choice. One of the books is Stamped from the Beginning. Another one is, that's my first choice, so I don't remember the others. Agility, but being in practice with others in terms of just story sharing and thinking about what this moment actually is, as opposed to the way it's being narrated in this moment. There's a difference between what it actually is and how it's being narrated to us on all of our screens. I think it's important. It offers us more power to determine how we engage and live and practice. Otherwise, I think we're just going to get more of the same or worse. Yeah.
You're already kind of venturing into this space, but do you have any advice for people who are also in this work?
Link arms and phone a friend. I think that's the most important thing. I have a chain of inclusion practitioners, equity inclusion practitioners, who I text with and phone with and have virtual brunches with and vent with, and also listen to. Sometimes it's important to just sit and listen. That also reminds you that you're not experiencing something on your own. But yeah, if you're in this work, phone a friend, because I think it might be really easy to feel defeated or in this moment, or feel like your measures aren't measuring up. I'm not sure that it's really important to measure anything right now, which is not I don't know how a corporation would feel about that. But this is such human work that I think that if you need to be connected to humanity, connect with other people in as many ways as you can. And for me, Bar We, building anti-racist white educators, is something I feel like I need to engage with in so many respects, because I need to be reminded that there are white educators who are determined to show up as accomplices and allies in this moment for people who are really struggling or being attacked right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Brendon. I think that's how we'll conclude our episode today. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.